Thank you all for joining and thank you for having me here today. And thanks for organizing this panel discussion. We work very closely with the EastWest Institute on holding these regular regional cyber dialogues around the globe, bringing together leading cyber experts and decision makers from government, private sector, academia and civil society. So I think this is, since I started about a month ago, my fourth opportunity to see Bruce. And I find it interesting that it is indeed possible in the current COVID times to build up relationships just by speaking with one another online. I believe today's panel discussion is exactly the kind of conversation we ought to be having more often. In fact, having multiple stakeholders from different backgrounds around the table is one of the priorities of the Dutch approach to cyberspace. Historically, multi-stakeholderism has been at the heart of issues that require public-private cooperation in the Netherlands. And already in the 13th century, local communities recognized the need to work together in institutions to protect their land against floods. In cyberspace too, there is a clear need to balance the interests of all stakeholders. Public-private partnerships are essential for keeping the internet free, open and secure. More than 95% of cyberspace is civilian. It is operated by the private sector without a centralized authority. This is one of the main merits of the internet, but it is also means that focusing our efforts on separate part of cybersecurity and working in silos will not make the problem of cyber insecurity go away. For the Netherlands, the hack on the certification company DigiNotar in 2011 really put cybersecurity at the top of our political agenda. We took national and international measures then to increase digital resilience, such as instituting a duty to report cyber attacks and establishing the Public-Private National Cybersecurity Center and an independent Public-Private Cybersecurity Council. But engaging with different stakeholders does not stop at national borders, as we know. And the Netherlands has a highly digitalized economy. And one of the largest internet hubs of the world is in Amsterdam. And this explains why the Netherlands took the lead in some international discussions on cyber policies. In 2015, we organized the Global Conference on Cyberspace, which led to initiatives such as the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace and the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. We also actively engage in the UN processes on norms of responsible state behavior. I will make the rest of my opening remarks along three lines: trust, awareness, and capacity building. First, trust is key to reaping the economic and societal benefits of cyberspace. We all trust in digital solutions that enable us to meet each other here today. Trust that we can communicate without breach, and without an appropriate level of security, there cannot be trust in digital solutions. Every malicious cyber operations by state or non-state actors alike erodes trust. And in order to nurture trust, it is imperative that actors are held accountable through diplomatic responses such as targeted sanctions. Recently, we saw the release of the Digital Defense Report by Microsoft. These kinds of publications, highlighting the sophistication of cyber threats and calling out states that engage in irresponsible behavior, really helps raise awareness and nurtures trust between stakeholders. Secondly, awareness about the opportunities and the risks of cyberspace has increased globally during COVID-19. And this is actually part of the good news. Awareness includes talking to each other as technical and policy experts. Working in the field of cyber diplomacy, I experienced that cyberspace demands technical action as much as it poses normative and political challenges. We cannot afford to confront a technical issue such as attribution without keeping the normative perspective in mind and vice versa. Awareness of cyber risks also plays a role as countries develop their digital economies. Right now, with 50% of the world population still having no access to the internet, there is a huge global connectivity gap. As that gap closes, countries experience their levels of digitalization maturing, access to the internet spreads throughout population, and economies become more reliant on cyberspace. But we also tend to see a rise in cybersecurity problems then. Taking stringent security measures when stakeholders already rely on infrastructure is much more difficult than integrating security solutions in the developmental stages of countries' digital economies. And the fact that many countries are in the middle of digitalizing creates opportunities for capacity building efforts. And that brings me to my third and last point. One of the promising and mutually beneficial areas for public-private cooperation is indeed capacity building. In an interconnected world, weak ICT security in some will amplify vulnerability in all the others. And in that light, the Netherlands established the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which has matured into a strong public-private capacity building foundation. And Chris Painter will tell you all about the GFCE, I'm sure. For now, I will give the floor back to Bruce, and thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing and learning from you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathalie. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Welcome to all people who have just joined us. And let me now turn it over to Andreas Kuhn, EWI Senior Program Associate, who's pulled this thing together today and is going to give brief framing remarks. Andreas.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Nathalie, for your opening remarks. And thank you for all participants for taking the time to be here this morning or this evening, wherever you are around the globe. And in particular, also the cyber team for helping making this all possible. Cooperation is an essential building block of modern human society. Strong cooperation-based institutions guarantee security and stability. This also applies to cyberspace, where security and trust are preconditions for harvesting social and economic benefits that cyberspace and new emerging technologies afford. The Internet's technical foundation is a set of agreed upon technical standards and protocols based on rough consensus and running code. Similarly, security in cyberspace is fundamentally a cooperative endeavor because it requires cooperation and coordination of technical, organizational, and policy elements owned by or within the purview of many different private sector businesses and government agencies, as well as civil society and, of course, the end users. The distributed nature of the Internet requires global cooperation among all these different players. The current global environment, however, is driving the players apart, not together. COVID-19 has shown that conflict and competition are currently favored over cooperation. Cyber criminals, to use an example, are targeting ill-protected critical infrastructures such as hospitals, leaving patients at potential catastrophic risk. Effective, swift security cooperation could be a game changer here. Mounting geopolitical tensions, the US-China tech Cold War, nation states, isolationist tendencies, and election interference around the globe create significant barriers for international cybersecurity cooperation. Rather than making the case for cooperation, reduced trust and security exacerbates the potential for conflict. Our panelists today will discuss a series of domains for cybersecurity, and to set the stage, I will mention just a few critical ones. Cooperation among law enforcement in the fight against cybercrime is an example. While cybercrime is global in nature, law enforcement remains mostly local. More effective and efficient cooperation across jurisdictions is needed. Information sharing within industry and with governments in a timely manner to prevent and respond effectively to cyber incidents. Too often, incentives for information sharing remain misaligned, resulting in organizations holding back rather than sharing critical information in a timely manner. Reaching agreement on permissible behavior of state actors in cyberspace and fostering cyber capacity building efforts, as Nathalie mentioned, to raise the security baseline. Political considerations and ideological differences are major stumbling blocks for making progress on the normative end of cyber cooperation. These efforts are crucial to strengthen cyberspace security and stability. While cooperation among like-minded states is a good start, we need a comprehensive, inclusive approach. Alliances that include some countries but not others, some industry sectors but not others, some companies but not others, fall short of taking full advantage of cybersecurity cooperation. The results are disjointed, fragmented solution that perpetuate the risk of balkanizing cyberspace into splinter nets with data localization requirements. This is exactly the opposite of an open and free internet. Today's panel discussion will give you a unique insight about the current state of cybersecurity cooperation and its obstacles. I want to end with an African proverb that summarizes succinctly my framing remarks. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Bruce, back to you.
Thanks very much, Andreas. I appreciate it. And great opening up. We're happy to have so many people here today to discuss the paradox of cybersecurity cooperation and the challenges of getting that happening. And so I want to, if you could put up the slide quickly for the panelists who are going to be coming up for us, that would be great. All right, so we have, as you can see, a great lead off here. We have a couple of people who are former commissioners of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, and a variety of different groups here represented. They'll be speaking from the perspective of work that each of them is doing or is part of that is promoting cyber cooperation. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, there's many other cyber cooperation organizations on the call. We'll be hearing from some of them after the speakers. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to Elina Noor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you, Andreas, and the rest of the EWI team for having me on this panel. I don't have any profound proverbs to start with, whether from Africa or elsewhere, but let me offer some overview remarks structured along three thoughts. The first is this: cybersecurity dividends coexist with cybersecurity divides. This is my shameless paraphrase of the UN Secretary General's original phrase, which is digital dividends coexist with digital divides, during his launch speech of the Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. In other words, we need cooperation because there are tension points. Divisions exist for innumerable reasons, and they exist within and among different stakeholders. They exist because of inadequate representation in international forums, because states cannot agree on how international law should apply in cyberspace, because boardroom imperatives and national security agendas don't always align, because conceptions and limits of rights differ, and because of a lack of a capacity, which I believe Chris Painter will speak to shortly. We also need cooperation because we are interdependent. This interdependence is a reality because of comparative economic advantages that facilitate global supply chains. At one point, interdependence was also aspirational, because more than warm, fuzzy connotations of trust and reliability and collaboration, it was also a practical, cost-effective means of realizing technological or developmental goals, particularly for smaller economies through cooperation. That interdependence and cooperation is now at stake because of geopolitical pressures and ultimatums that threaten to upend established supply chains, drive up costs, and potentially, as Andreas mentioned, cleave, if not fragment, the internet, and undermine the security and stability of the internet in general. But, and this is my second point, despite current fissioning pressures, there remain encouraging signs of commitment to cooperate. At the technical level, CERTs, for example, still cooperate closely to secure critical infrastructure, quite separately from political considerations. At the state level, although the 2019 UN GGE and OEWG, the UN GGE and OEWG processes were conceived in parallel fashion, there was a deliberate decision by both chairs from the outset to work together rather than separately, and to synchronize efforts along the way. This made sense given the overlap in composition between both processes, but the wide consultations of the OEWG also rounded out the knowledge pool for GGE members. The involvement of civil society in OEWG consultations also raised diverse perspectives in terms of issues and geographical representation. Further, the endorsement of the multi-stakeholder model by groupings such as the UN Secretary General's High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation, the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, even the Christchurch Call in the area of violent extremist content, and the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace point towards a positive trend towards cooperation from many different parties. The third and final point is by way of disclosure. Together with some of the more eminent commissioners on this call, I served on the GCSE, where despite different professional backgrounds and countries of origin, 28 commissioners from 16 countries were able to come to agreement on several key premises, principles, and additional norms complementary to the 11 UNGGE norms. One of our key premises is this: that although international security and stability are almost exclusively the responsibility of states, cyberspace is designed, deployed, and operated primarily by non-state actors. Non-state actors are also the first to respond to and even attribute cyber attacks. 4 principles guided our work at the GCSE. Responsibility, that is, everyone is responsible for ensuring the stability of cyberspace. Restraint, no state or non-state actor should take actions that impair the stability of cyberspace. The requirement to act, state or non-state actors should take reasonable and appropriate steps to ensure the stability of cyberspace. And respect for human rights, which is self-explanatory. If you are so inclined, feel free to check out our report online for a full list of 8 proposed norms. I won't go through all of them, but I will point out that our first, and in some ways foundational norm proposed, relates to the protection of the public core of the internet. While the definition of the public core is challenging, as we ourselves found during discussions, we settled on the inclusion of critical elements of the internet's infrastructure, such as packet routing and forwarding, naming and numbering systems, the cryptographic mechanisms of security and identity, transmission media, etc. We argue that tampering with the general availability or integrity of the public core of the internet would impact the stability of the internet. Let me leave you with this final thought. In order for there to be meaningful cooperation between the producers and users or consumers of the internet, there must be meaningful representation at the dialogue table. Today, 2/3 of the world's population lives in Asia, and by the turn of the century, 90% of the world's population is expected to live outside Europe and North America. Most of them will live in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. For cooperation to take place, therefore, there must be equal partnerships and an equitable say by the largest populations in the world on developments in security and cyberspace. Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa cannot simply continue to be locales for resource extraction and markets for sale and profit. Cooperation implies equivalency and reciprocity. But in the age of technology where demographics makes data, cooperation should be just a little more equal. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks so much, Alina. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Alina, and thank you all for being here and hosting us for this, I think, really timely and important discussion. I would say I agree with everything Alina said. I'd add, look at our Global Commission report, even if you're not so inclined. Just look at it. It's, I think, a very helpful document. But I want to emphasize a few things. We talked a little bit about the parallel UN processes, the GG, and this is now, there have been several GGs in the past that have made significant progress, including on agreeing to 11 norms of state behavior, on agreeing that international law applies, on agreeing that CBMs, confidence building measures, are important. That's all great. And now we have this new OEWG. And I agree with what was said earlier. They've worked in complementary to each other, which is important. And the good thing about the open-ended working group is it's involved more states. Because as we look at this issue, as this important stability issue, and really all the important issues in cyberspace, I think there have been a couple flaws and challenges in the current system too. One is that, as Elena said at the end, a lot of states are not involved in these discussions. They may be involved in New York and they have representatives there, but they're not really invested in these discussions. A lot of the global South has not really had the ability to participate at a full level. And we need to change that, because this is not just a discussion among so-called great powers. This is a discussion for everyone, because cyberspace really is meant to benefit everyone. So having more inclusivity among states is a key part of it, particularly in the global South. The second issue is, as much as I think the UN has tried to make some efforts to be multi-stakeholder, it's still a growing process. The UN was not built to deal with non-state stakeholders. They had a very good meeting in December on the OEWG, but like many meetings that did mostly consist of people making little speeches, and not a lot of interaction between the states and the other stakeholders. And we need to change that too, because one lesson I think of the Global Commission and a lot of these other things that have gone on is that kind of collaboration between not just state representatives, but non-state representatives, academia, civil society, and industry has been critically important. And the third observation is we're not really good at communicating this to the parties and the sectors we're trying to protect. So my example of that is one of the GG norms from 2015 was don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country. Another one was don't attack the CSIRTs or the CERTs, the computer emergency response teams. They're like the hospitals or the ambulances on the internet. 3 years later, I'm giving a keynote speech to the FIRST, the Forum of Incident and Response and Security Teams in Malaysia, actually. And after I gave the speech, a couple of people in the audience were asking questions. They said, well, it'd be great if the UN said something about this. And I said, the UN did say something about this 2 years ago. And so we need to have a better connection between the policy wonks, which many of us are, and the people who are in the trenches on these issues. And that will actually help our debate as well. So those are three issues. One way to address this has been through greater capacity building. And when I was at several of the meetings in New York, I was really heartened to hear almost every country raise the issue of capacity building as a foundational pillar in terms of moving this discussion ahead. And many very nicely mentioned the GFC as a good enabler for that. And the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise was set up with the idea of coordinating and promoting cybersecurity capacity building around the world. It is often, even our resources in this area are not that big. Coordination is really important. Countries and others don't know where to go. And so it's important to have some coordinating mechanisms. We have about 135, I think, partners and members now, including over 60 countries, private sector, civil society, and academia. That multi-stakeholder aspect is critically important. We've done a lot of work in terms of outreach around the globe. So it's not just a European thing. We had our last physical meeting in Addis Ababa, hosted by the African Union. So this effort is really trying to make capacity building, not just the technical capacity building, like how you do incident response, but the policy capacity building. How do you have a national strategy to prioritize this, to make it more a high level priority on a political level? How do you deal with implementing the norms that we've talked about and reaching out to countries so they can play in this game of cyber diplomacy? That's another group, and Kaya's played a big role in that as well. So it's really, both on the policy and technical level, trying to promote this, trying to make sure that we have better capacity building around the world along a couple of different pillars. One is coordination, as I said, actually coordinating what's out there. Another is knowledge sharing. And one of the things that we have set up is something called the Sybil portal, which is a portal where lots of best practices and other things from around the world are there for anyone to see. And I think that's important. A key part of it is a clearinghouse function. So that if a state comes to the GFC and says, we need help, and we've had several that have had, we can do a matchmaking function, find both the other states, private sector, civil society, implementers, and funders who can help them actually get what they need. And we've done that on several occasions. We need to move that further. And the fourth is a research agenda. There's lots of gaps in the world. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but there's lots of gaps that we need to identify and then try to fill. So that's a recent thing that we're doing too. All of that is driven by various working groups that deal with policy, deal with incident response, deal with cybercrime. And I encourage, if you're not involved in this, and many of you are, we really encourage you to be involved. I will just lastly touch on that's been an important enabler for us. I think it's going to be a really important thing going forward as more countries are turning to this. I think to the extent there's a plus side of COVID, it's more countries now understand the importance of cybersecurity, and hopefully we'll prioritize that, but we need to really work on that. But one overarching issue I think I wanted to close with is that, as important as all of us on this call think cybersecurity is, it's often still a boutique issue around the world. You go to a leader level and you talk about cybersecurity and their eyes still kind of glaze and they want to get out of the room. And they say, well, that's a technical issue. And I've said many times, you don't need to be a nuclear scientist to understand the importance of nuclear policy. You don't need to be a coder to understand the implications on national security, economics, and diplomacy of cybersecurity. You should have some people who actually know what the trade space is to help inform you, but you need to have, I think, more understanding of that. And I think we need to treat this as a core national security issue, but also a core economic issue, because those communities, even with government, are often somewhat at odds with each other, or at least conflicting. So we need to really treat this as a holistic issue that is really an issue going forward in our time. And I think that's certainly a challenge. That's something that I think we're better off now than we were 10 years ago. But even in the area of capacity building, we can't think of just cybersecurity capacity building. This should be a foundational element of our overall development goals, the UN and other development goals. We need to mainstream cyber, so it's not this boutique, but is a core issue that we're dealing with around the world. And thank you for hosting this, because I think that helps advance that ball.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, we are looking at cooperation that's going on, and we also want to be talking about some of the barriers to cooperation, what is causing us not to be able, because we do need to have a united effort on a global basis in this area. Well, we've been talking about norms and policy and also capacity building in a very broad sense. Key to this, to progress in this area, of course, are the great ICT companies from countries all around the world. We can't have them all speak today, but we have a representative from one, Microsoft, who has, as we know, led a great deal of work to pull together people and companies around various issues in the cybersecurity space. And here from Microsoft is Kaya Shielik to give us a perspective on some of their work.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I would first of all echo pretty much a lot of what Elena and Chris said before. I think the importance of cooperation and coordination in this space across the different geographies, across the different sectors, across the different stakeholder groups cannot be overstated. We have come, to this issue probably more than 10 years ago now, and have felt that there is the discussions on international aspects of cybersecurity are critically important, but really poorly understood by others in the private sector, to be honest, as well as many in the civil society. And so have been really excited to see initiatives like the GFCE being stood up to try and illuminate some of the connections between how these nebulous discussions at the UN or other international fora that are held in sort of small dark rooms by diplomats impact the day-to-day of companies, of individuals, because we cannot forget that those international agreements have to be translated at some level into the domestic frameworks to be implemented. And that's often where the industry or the technologies at large first pay attention. Chris mentioned the multi-stakeholder consultation that the Open-Ended Working Group held last year, which was one of the first one of the first sessions that were designed to hear views from stakeholders and not just governments. Like Chris said, it was the discussion was very people talked at each other, which is the format for many of these events. And I will say we cannot but underline the point that Chris made about the importance of continuous dialogue. Earlier today, we had a call actually within the GFCE, as Chris chairs, and he pointed out that the private there is a multi-stakeholder representation there. But there is a struggle because these are very different groups, and this, is valid across the board. These are very different stakeholders with very different objectives, very different references and frames. So the value of conversation of understanding the perspective from which each stakeholder group is coming from cannot be overstated. I think much of the to be honest, much of the benefits comes to it just from having a conversation about a particular word and what it means in different contexts. Just because otherwise, a lot of the times, these groups are talking at each other or just across from each other rather than having an actual conversation. Nowhere is this nowhere has this been clearer than perhaps in the Wassenaar Agreement discussions a few years back, where with very good intentions, some rules were passed that had really bad implications for the private sector and technologists, security researchers more broadly. And this is kind of an example I want to use to just highlight the importance of having the private sector at the table to explain a lot of the times how our technology works, and what a particular rule or law or change or norm could mean for the online environment, and also how it could be improved to achieve the desired goal. I will also maybe just really quickly finish to make sure that we have some room for conversation at the end. I will also say the importance of raising awareness. Like I said earlier, not many companies, not many technologies know about these processes, and they don't know about the implications. And this is why we, a few years back, were a founding member of an organization called the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, which really strive to bring together, I think now over 150 companies, in technology companies writ large, some secure ones, some platform providers, to both ensure that they commit to a set of principles. So, if we ask governments to hold themselves accountable to certain norms and not do certain behaviors, it's equally important that companies do that. So one of the principles, for example, is to commit to not engage in offensive operations in cyberspace, but to also raise awareness of that these are some of the conversations that are happening and bring more companies to the table. And hopefully we succeeded in that for at least a little bit. I think there's a similar challenge, and when it comes to civil society, except there's an even greater pressure on resources there. So I would probably call on everyone to try and find ways to empower these conversations to be more productive and more inclusive. And perhaps the current COVID environment where we all sort of sit behind our screens is a unique opportunity in that way.
Thanks so much, Kaya, and thanks for the added, vocalizations from your colleague there.
Sorry about that.
No, very nice to have other beings in the call in these calls. All right, well, you heard a little bit about the Cybersecurity Alliance, and we also have here what I kind of think about the Tech Accord event. We have here what I consider the European counterpart, if you will. No offense meant to either side of this. It's another coalition of companies, and we're very happy to have Leo Simonovic, who's the Vice President and Global Head for Industrial Cyber Policy at Siemens. Leo, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me. You might not think of Siemens as a cybersecurity company. We are known as an engineering company that's been around for 173 years. And yet, it was our PLCs that were impacted by Stuxnet 10 years ago. And since then, over the next decade, we've been on a journey to first secure ourselves. We started by focusing on our products and making those more secure. We hired over 1,000 people. We joined many of the world's certs. And yet, as the world became more digitalized, as more critical infrastructure assets were being brought online, we somehow didn't feel more secure. We became more interdependent on our customers, and our customers became more interdependent on us. And yet, what else we saw was an exponential increase in attacks targeting critical infrastructure. These are your power plants, refineries, substations, critical manufacturing, the backbone of the global economy. Industrial cyber became the new risk frontier. Digitalization and the move in the energy sector, where I spend most of my time, towards renewables, towards decentralized energy, offers enormous promise to optimize assets, to gain efficiencies, and to uncover new business models. And yet the cyber attacks are eroding trust. And this was our motivating factor, our call to action to do something about this. We wanted to secure the physical and digital world, but we knew that it needed a collaborative approach. We knew that we needed to build collective defenses, and that we as Siemens were at the center of the value chain. There was a whole supply chain in the back of us, and then there were parts of the value chain that were in front of us. And so we needed to think about how to take responsibility in helping secure the digital economy and the physical world that's associated with it. So at the Munich Security Conference, we announced the Charter of Trust, which is our global compact that brings together asset owners, some of the largest infrastructure operators like Total, for example, technology companies like Dell and Cisco, but also insurers to help manage risk. Before, these companies didn't really talk to one another. IT did its own thing. Operational technology was something that was done by engineers. We needed to create bridges, and we needed to do it in a way that was simple and that ultimately got to action, which is really important. So we signed the Charter of Trust, and then we normed around 10 principles, and we've been tackling each of those principles in its own right. So if you look at the Charter of Trust, there are some common sense things that any company should undertake. Ownership for cyber and IT security, responsibility throughout the digital supply chain, security by default, user centricity, innovation and co-creation, education. What's important about all of these, and I like to think of them as like a house, you need to build a foundation. If you start with the principle of ownership, in that principle, and what we found is there were many companies that did not address operational technology. They didn't address production environments, the field. Who owns it? How do we tackle it? And so, in giving security the necessary mandate. So our chief security officer reports directly to the board member and our new CEO. And this person looks after security holistically. So IT security, product security, and factory security. We operate something like 400 factories around the world. So we've been thinking about ownership, but also how to tackle key issues like workforce development. When I think of operational technology, it's like the endangered species, because this individual has to have IT experience, network experience, controls experience, turbine experience, very hard to find. So we needed to build a workforce that's able to look at the physical and digital worlds together. You know what we found that was really interesting was that when we all got together, the core thing that we needed to understand was that we didn't speak the same language, and we needed to address that. And speaking the same language, you know, between IT players and OT players. Sorry, my 3-year-old just joined me. So this is the beauty of working from home. It's been really key. The last thing I'll say before closing is COVID has been the great accelerator. A lot of the orthodoxies of having barriers between your operational technology and your information technologies are being broken down out of necessity. You have plant operators that are working from home. And so in all of this, the connectivity and the interdependence is becoming greater. It is important that we as industry lead the way, but that we get to work and that we don't just talk about issues, but act on them and innovate with purpose around the topic of industrial cyber and the new digital economy and the opportunities that it brings. Back to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you for allowing your 3-year-old to join us. That's what one of the things another one of the many upsides of this horrible situation we find ourselves in. Thanks for the underscoring about IoT. We are moving on this panel now towards a more concrete dimension of things, which is interesting. This is not just a discussion about norms and policies, all of which are important. And in that spirit, I'm happy to welcome Chris Blast from Unisys, who is a key man on the Linux Foundation DBOM consortium, which he will mention what that DBOM is. It's not the same as a Zoom bomb. Over to you, Chris.
It probably isn't. So thank you, Bruce. Thanks to the Institute and the co-panelists and everybody else on the call for the time. And what I'm going to try to do is weave this all together, right? You know, so as Natalie was saying, you know, trust and awareness and capacity building. You know, we have structures in place that we're working down paths. And Alina, your conversations about how the supply chains are driving the need for global governance, and Chris Painter, you know, you followed that, talking about the representation or lack thereof with the global South, for example, and we can expand on that. Kaya, you know, the coordination is critical but poorly understood. But as I get to my point, and I think the DBOM consortium is an example of it, we have the pieces, and we're going in an inevitable direction. We'll put that together. You know, while we have different stakeholders, and most organizations don't know about this, some of them do, and we've got relatively medium maturity components to put together to make this all work. And Leo, your transit at the end there is perfect. You know, you are literally Siemens, and as you said, you know, you've gone through the StuckNet issue. They put in place people like you and the structures you're talking about and the solutions you've been putting in place, and you're seeing, you know, transiting directly into the Linux Foundation context of this, the digitization and renewables on a new frontier. And you use the term value chain, which I find striking, because the value chain of information is a term we use in the DBOM consortium that speaks to many of these issues. And it's, you know, we need to understand, as we're working through the individual issues and these more complex issues, that we're all in various ways on inevitability curves. You know, these issues, you know, in my notes to myself for this bit that I put paradox in quotes. You know, the paradox of cooperation is only a paradox because we're at a certain point in all of this. You know, I see, you know, friends and contacts and folks on here, you know, Whit and Mark Weatherford, of course, you know, pick on you, but you're not, you know, I'm the young kid of the old guys, of the old folks in this, and we're still at it. You know, not many of us have given up. You know, this is not a highly developed area, this entire cyber thing, much less cybersecurity. But as each of the speakers has said so far, and everybody on this call knows, it is critical, it is real, it's intrinsic, it has real impacts, it's permanent. And looking forward, we will either have solved these issues, all of these issues we're talking about, to a reasonable level in the future, or we won't. And it's not that it's impossible, it's about the timing, right? So the fact that we're having this conversation today is an indicator. It tells us things about the state of all these issues. This conversation wasn't exactly the conversation with Bruce and Lawson and so forth 4 years ago, talking about digital cities and so forth in the EastWest Institute. Each of these conversations moving forward, our ability to function and the shapes of the solutions are becoming more clear, because we're at a maturity crux in the cooperation curve right now. For all of the reasons that were stated by all the speakers, all of my interactions with many of you on this call, my interactions with EastWest Institute started in my ISAC days, where information sharing, ISACs, ISOs, sticks and tacks, all that was the conversation. That's still not finished, but it's not the hot moment now. But the meta thread of cooperation is in laws and governance. Mentioned in the very beginning of this call when we're warming up, the Bureau of Cyber Statistics in the U.S. government is being created. Just the other day that was stated, we're going to go down that path. We can all say, what are statistics and how do we gather them, but we'll have that conversation. We'll come out the end of it. The AMIT framework for cognitive security in supply chains. So the Digital Bill of Materials Consortium, I think, is a good example of all this. Not that I'm biased at all, but this came out of a big corporation. So I work in the office of the CTO and do innovative things at Unisys, a big stodgy old 140-year-old company. And we were entertaining various ideas, thought of this early last year, and looking at it, thought, we're a relatively big company, but as we're talking earlier, we're not that big compared to all companies, and all of us here represent the biggest companies or have worked at them various times. And you find out that you can be the biggest company or the biggest government or the biggest country, and that's still not enough. To solve the part of the supply chain issue that we're trying to solve at the Linux Foundation with this consortium, everybody has to do the same thing. And while we have all these challenges, and while they feel very real now, and they are, anybody who's been around for several decades in this has been through various other challenges where things seem just that hard. However, we've moved forward. With supply chain issues are driving down past for all sorts of reasons. Inside Unisys, for our business purposes, as many of the speakers have discussed earlier, we're looking at why would we focus on this, and we're finding good reasons. Just inside the energy sector in the U.S. market, NERC CIP 13 came out 8 days ago and is driving utilities down that path. Attestation sharing, for a number of reasons, seems to be timely. It seems very clearly to be timely. I see Julie Goodman from the Linux Foundation Energy Project on the call as well, coordinating with the members and the stakeholders there, just in that sector, which is an enormous global sector, but it represents all of the other sectors. And to do that, to get supply chain security in the energy sector globally, nationally, at any given level, requires us to understand that cooperation is not a paradox. The paradoxes of cooperation are the artifacts that come up along the way as we're building these structures. But there is enough technology in place, and there's enough structure in place with regulatory structure, legislative structure, corporate structure, financial structure, technical structure, to build these things on. We as Unisys and the other partners have been involved, along some of them are on this call, Bosch and all the rest, decided we would do this because we can. Because we as individual organizations make money, save money, have competitive advantages, and by the way, make supply chain security better. And that we can do that with what's on hand, with reasonable amounts of effort, without starting from scratch, without waiting excuse me, so long for public entities or markets to move forward, that we can begin now. And I think that's true of almost every issue we're talking about here. There's been a lot of work done. The people on this call represent, the 40 or so years that we've been developing cybersecurity. We've solved enormous challenges of cooperation before, or we wouldn't be having this call. And I see no reason that we're not going to continue to do so. So with that, I'll end my soapbox and hand it back to you, Bruce.
Hey, thanks, Chris, and thanks for the positive energy. It's really, really good. It's like cooperation is hard, and working with people who are competitors or sometimes thought of as adversaries can be difficult. So I really appreciate your at least letting us pat ourselves on the back a little bit in this context. And congratulations for the work you're doing on the Digital Bill of Materials. All right. Before we get into a couple of short interventions and Q&A, I can see right now as the moderator, I'm failing in my job. We're running over. We'll extend the time of this for 15 minutes. No one's required to be here, of course, but we hope people can stick around and have a little discussion. Natalie, I turn the floor back over to you for any final remarks before we turn into a more interactive piece here.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. The panelists have not disappointed me, and of course I'm new on the job, so I have still, even though my learning curve has already been steep, I'm still going up that steep learning curve. Actually, this morning I received this request for a new multi-stakeholder informal meeting on the open-ended working group, and we were not yet discussing that internally, but this is the one, at least the one take that I get out of this, that of course we need to do that. I think the point made by various speakers that we come from so many different backgrounds, private sector, government, NGOs, we all have a different mindsets, perhaps different goals. So at least to talk to one another and create some level of understanding so that in our reflexes, we automatically reach out to each other when we think, hey, this might have an impact on you, or I may want to get your input on this because then we will have a better solution. I think that is, it's a key point that people made. I will stop here because I really look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie. So, speaking of, we do have a diverse group here. As I said earlier, there are many cooperative organizations here. I also want to welcome some of our Russian and Chinese colleagues. Professor Streltsov, it's great to see you. Dr. Smirnov, Vladimir, really great. So thank you for coming, and many Chinese colleagues are here as well. I want to now turn over to Q&A. We're going to talk a little bit about barriers. If you have thoughts about barriers and how we can overcome it, you can start populating the chat room with questions. And also about building trust among diverse companies. So I think those are a couple topics. I want to I want to start by taking up the point that Natalie made at the beginning about people on the front lines, and we are very happy here to have two people who are running consortia or leading consortia, I would say, since consortia you never run them, right? You just lead them. Who are on the front lines. And let me start with Serge Droz, who is the chairman of the aforementioned Forum of Incident Response globally. It's all yours for a brief intro, brief intervention, Serge.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Great panel here. I just want to give the perspective of the, what was called the ambulance, or what we like to call ourselves, the firefighters on the ground. So first brings together the incident response teams, and they're really kind of like the ambulance or the firefighters. They're the first ones on the ground when an incident happened, when a breach happened. And what has made us so successful in this really enormous monstrosity called internet is that we have been able to work together informally across the globe. And I really mean across the globe. That means incident response teams from competing companies work together. So the Google people work together with the Microsoft people. They compete in a lot of things, but not in terms of security. The same is true for states, actually. So I think FIRST is one of the few places where we have the security teams of most of the European states, of Russia, China, Taiwan, and all of these countries getting together, exchanging knowledge, and actually, in case of an incident, working together. But this is somewhat under threat. So in the beginning, someone mentioned that, well, the certs, they still work together and it's all fine. Actually, it's not. We see a lot of kind of polarization and politicization of the world, and in particular also cyberspace. And first, for example, had to suspend 3 Chinese members in good standing just because they all of a sudden were under sanctions. And so the kind of misuse of policy instruments, and I don't want to criticize sanctions, but what I criticize is the wrong use of sanctions actually starts weakening the system that really helps to keep the bases together with that. And I could go on and on and on. I want to stop here. So too long didn't read is CSIRTs work together informally, and policymakers really need to make sure that we can continue doing this.
Thank you so much for that, Serge. And you know, this is the unintended consequences department. So thank you for that, pointing that out. We have also here Michael Daniel, who runs the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is another set of frontline activities among companies to share cyber threat information and help each other and help their customers be safer and more secure. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for having me. It's as always a good discussion, and I know many of the people on the panel and otherwise in the room, so that's great. So I'd say that you know, the Cyber Threat Alliance is really designed to answer a question within the cybersecurity industry of how do we stop talking about information sharing and start doing information sharing. And you know, Bruce, you mentioned barriers, and most of those, it actually turns out, are not in fact technical. Most of the barriers are more about process and policy, and so CTA was really designed to address those. So CTA focuses not on the end users, but on the cybersecurity providers, those that are actually providing cybersecurity services to others, because we discovered that that was a part of the ecosystem that did not have good sharing and had not engaged in the kind of information sharing that some of the other sectors you know, have gone on. We enable sharing through a couple of different channels, but primarily we focus on enabling both automated sharing and human-to-human sharing, because it turns out you actually need both. If you really want to do information sharing well in cybersecurity, you need to move at net speed. So you got to have the automated side, but it also turns out the humans are still really important. So you got to have the ability to consume at human speed. CTA was built to design business rules to actually address many of the things that were barriers to sharing. So for example, we actually have a requirement among our members that you must share. So that deals with some of the free rider problems. We promote transparency, so there's no sort of anonymous submissions to CTA. Everybody always knows where that data comes from, so you understand the provenance of the data. And we also weight things differently, so not all information is created equal. So we promote context over just a raw indicator, for example. So at the end of the day, CTA is really about taking and making a cultural change in the cybersecurity industry. Because for too long, the cybersecurity industry competed on the idea that, or functioned on the idea that my value add comes from what I know. And actually, as Chris was pointing out, that, you know, I worked for the US government for many years, and not even the US government knows everything that it needs to know. And so that kind of argument is sort of like saying my inadequate pool of data is bigger than her inadequate pool of data, so you should go with me. That's not a very convincing argument. So instead, CTA promotes the idea that your competitive edge as a cybersecurity company comes from what you do with the data, not on the raw data itself, and that you can cooperate on that sharing of the input to your ultimate product. And I'll just end with the other key lesson that we have learned is that sharing in this space is incredibly hard work. It requires dedicated resources, and you have to sustain those resources, both dollars and people, over time. And that's an incredibly daunting proposition. It is not just a matter of connecting the pipes and the information just flows. That's not how it works. Similarly, we should expect, as we try to promote different kinds of cooperation beyond information sharing, it equally will require sustained investment of dollars and people over time, because it will be hard work. It will not be easy. So that's where I will leave it.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for that practical and advice from the front lines of the school of hard knocks of experience. So, all right. If you have a question or a comment, please let us know in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the raise your hand feature. But at the moment, we have a question here. How can directions and critical demand scale? How do you scale? So here's a good one. How do you scale from the national, international down to the local and urban city government context? This is like sort of the great powers talk with each other in cyberspace. But what about everybody else? Any one of our panelists want to take on the local government piece of this? Anybody working with state, local, city governments?
Well, Bruce, this is Leo.
Okay, good.
How do we take a stab at this?
Yes.
So a couple of weeks ago, we announced a partnership with the New York Power Authority to build out a center of excellence. As many of you know, New York Power Authority provides 1/3 of the power to the city in the state of New York. And here's a great example of where we need to focus on small and medium-sized organizations that create interdependencies in our energy system. And to answer the question, how does it all flow down? Well, it needs to flow down very practically. So what many city governments and municipal utilities need are practical solutions that start with a core challenge that need to be solved. They need to understand their risk. And if we can help them get there without burdening them with regulation, especially regulation that leads to paperwork, that is sort of the philosophy that we need to undertake. So risk quantification begins with visibility and understanding what they have, but it also begins with getting some leverage, pooling of resources together with companies like ours, with other cities, so they have, frankly, more buying power in the market and can build up more capacity to run their cyber programs.
Bruce, this is Chris, just to add to that. There's a lot that's being done at the state and local level in the U.S. and I suspect around the world in various areas, including on cybercrime and cybersecurity. And I think you need to have that local awareness and engagement for this to actually work. You know, when I talked about this has to be a national level priority, it doesn't become a national level priority if people don't care about it at the local level. So we need to do a better job of convincing folks that. But as I said, especially in my old background in the law enforcement community, there's been quite a lot of good efforts locally. Uneven, people have more resources and bigger cities are able to do that more than others, but I think that's an important element.
Thank you. I think, Chris, and thank you, Phil Reidinger, for a shout out to you for putting up the New York City, one of the larger cities, page article about what they've been up to. So I thought a good question here about anybody of our panelists want to talk about. This is one of the more diplomatic ways of saying this, I thought. So thank you, Larissa, in addressing the effects of interventionist top-down supply chain security policies in terms of their potential effects on capacity impacts in the supply chain. So this is all about the unintended consequences of nationalist policies. As you know, this tech nationalism is kind of a thing for us at EastWest. Anybody want to jump in on that one from the standpoint of kind of overall security impacts from national security policies?
Yeah, I'd love to take a stab at that. So this comes right down to what we're talking about with the DBOM consortium, right? And it's an interesting walking through all the different stakeholders through this year as the architecture is coming together, because it's all about attestation channels. So any two of us, any two organizations, a government and its constituents or whatnot, can attest to things in various ways. And policies are whatever you would like them to be. So, as a crusty old capitalist, I'm pretty happy with this one, because I think we will tend to follow the mean free path of regulation, where, God help us, as enterprises, we can't do it ourselves. We have to have some level playing field or whatnot. But the agility and opportunity in enterprise, I think gives us a lot of motivations to put these things in place before we get too much interventionist. It'll always be a combination. Many of us have developed standards and regulations and so forth, and try to make it as light as possible. NERCSIP 13 is a good example. Look at that guidance. Is it prescriptive? Does that work? We as the private sector will have to demonstrate we can, or somebody will make us.
Yeah, no, that's really true. And the more we can develop standards and transparent ways of seeing what's happening in the supply chain and sort of certifications, not that you can certify a ever evolving.
But you can attest.
Yes,
you can
test, and you can certify
have responsibilities, and that helps.
And you can certify processes, and you can look at processes, internal processes. So, but it's really good. Well, and as Patricia says here on the in the chat, we have the interesting thing that this is causing us to be able to get together more and more, but it also, the COVID situation has created some competitive things. We certainly are seeing a lot of uptake in terms of ICT and conferencing in the Global South. We, as Natalie mentioned, are doing a series of conferences. We have one coming up that's being conducted in Pretoria, or as they say in Pretoria, maybe next year we'll be able to do an offline conference. I'm like, wait, this is upside down. But, what we used to call a meeting, right? Anyway, so there is a lot of uptake. I think it is accelerating there, but as we also see, there's a geopolitical competition on who's going to get the vaccine first, and why is this? Why are we not doing better at collaborating across boundaries on perhaps one of the most huge and certainly widespread threats that we're all facing, and kind of attacks on the hospitals and stuff, cyber attacks on hospitals are a piece of all that.
But Bruce, I kind of think that creates an opportunity too, right? So the fact that more countries are saying digital technologies are core to our future survival is a good thing. It raises awareness. What I'd like them to do is not just look at that, but also look at the cybersecurity part of this and the risk. It doesn't help if countries have a digital strategy and no cybersecurity strategy. They should go hand in glove. And then the competition over the attacks on hospitals and theft of information. Look, again, I think that's raised awareness of why this issue is not just this theoretical issue, but one that's really important, why norms are important, why consequences for violations of norms are important. So I think we can turn that and use that to some benefit.
Well, and Patricia, to your first question, so a couple of years ago, I wrote a 25-year plan for Colombian national infrastructure, and it's less about particular punctuation, accelerated adoption of digital technologies. Short answer is yes, but I think the point that I want to get across is these are all parts of long trends. So we're punctuating some evolution that was latent already. So yes to number one, basically.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for having stuck around for another 15 minutes or so. So it's really been great to see everybody and to have a rich conversation. We'll be publishing this video on our website at the EastWest Institute, and we look forward to speaking to all of you again soon. So thanks again, especially to our panelists and interventions, both the written one, thank you, Kamlesh, and oral ones. So thanks to everyone for joining.